Welcome back to the Casual Ethnographer. My name is Elizabeth. I am your internet culture lady, and this is another long form video, another Casual Ethnographer talk. Today's episode, we will be covering Gaza and the West Bank between the years of 1960 and 1967. It is part 3 in our ongoing series, which is an audio only series, starting with what is Zionism and moving towards different events that happened in the area to help better understand contextually why Gaza is experiencing the situation that it is today. If you're new to my channel, the way that this works is that I pick a topic and I do my research, I make my notes, and then I take you through my notes. So you will hear me asking questions and flipping pages, just so you understand where my brain went as I was looking through things. So let's get started. Again, this is part 3 in our series, so if you're joining me for the first time, I want to give you a very quick sense of where we've already been. And if you've watched parts 1 and 2, this will help anchor where we're picking up today. In part 1, we looked at the origins of Zionism, how it emerged in the late 1800s, and why it resonated with Jewish communities facing rising anti-Semitism in Europe, and how early Zionist institutions and migration began reshaping life in Palestine long before the British Mandate. In part 2, we moved into the Mandate era itself. We traced how two national movements, Jewish and Arab Palestinian, developed in parallel, how British policies deepened tensions, and how the UN partition plan in 1947 triggered civil war. We followed the early months of the refugee crisis, and we ended with Gaza transformed into a crowded refugee enclave under Egyptian administration, carrying the trauma of the 1956 Suez Crisis. If you haven't watched those earlier parts, I recommend going back because everything we're about to cover builds directly on that foundation. Today in part 3, we're stepping into the years between 1960 and 1967. This is the period when Gaza is still under Egyptian rule, when Palestinian political life begins to organize in new ways, and when regional tensions slowly tighten toward the Six-Day War. It's a chapter that helps explain how Gaza moves from being a refugee enclave to becoming a territory under long-term occupation. So one of the things that I wanted to better understand before I dug into the time frame was what the geography was like, what conditions were people living under, because oftentimes those things participate in how human situations turn out. So let's start with the size of historic Palestine before the Mandate. So historic Palestine, as administered by the British after World War I, covered roughly 10,000 square miles, or about 26,000 square kilometers. This is about the size of Maryland or Haiti. It was never a large territory, which is why every shift in borders had immediate human consequences. What the map looked like by 1960. By 1960, the land once known as Mandatory Palestine had been divided into 3 distinct political spaces. So first, Israel, established 1948, was roughly 8,000 square miles, or about 20,700 square kilometers. This included the coastal plain, Galilee, the Negev Desert, and most major cities. 2. The West Bank, annexed by Jordan in 1950, roughly 2,200 square miles, or about 5,600 square kilometers. This region includes East Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethlehem, Nablus, and Jericho. It is mountainous, historically agricultural, and home to many of the oldest Palestinian towns. And third, the Gaza Strip, administered by Egypt, 140 square miles, or roughly 365 square kilometers. This is 25 miles long and 5 to 7 miles wide, one of the most densely populated places on Earth, even in 1960. Gaza is 1.4% the size of historic Palestine. So next, land versus population after 1948, and these proportions matter. Land controlled by Israel in 1960 was about 78% of historic Palestine. Palestinian population remaining inside Israel, about 10 to 15% of the total Palestinian population. Palestinians outside Israel, so refugees plus West Bank plus Gaza, were about 85 to 90% of Palestinians living on roughly 22% of the land, and concentrated heavily in 2 small areas, the West Bank and Gaza. This mismatch between land and population density is one of the defining pressures of the post-1948 landscape. So, what the West Bank is, for anyone who's not super familiar with the geography of the area, the name West Bank refers to the west bank of the Jordan River. So, it's a geographic term. And between 1948 and 1967, Jordan controlled the West Bank. Palestinians there became Jordanian citizens. It was the larger of the two Palestinian majority territories. It was landlocked, mountainous, and agriculturally important. The West Bank and Gaza were not connected. Travel between them required passing through Israel. Let's talk about shared water and resource realities. Water is one of the most important and least understood parts of the geography. Key water sources of the area. So the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, the mountain aquifer under the West Bank, and the coastal aquifer under Gaza. By 1960, Israel controlled the Jordan River headwaters and the Sea of Galilee, the region's most reliable freshwater sources. The West Bank's mountain aquifer flowed downward into Israel, making Israel dependent on water originating under Palestinian land. Gaza relied on the coastal aquifer, which was already under strain due to population density and limited recharge. This meant Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank had less land, fewer resources, and greater population pressure. Israel had more land, more water, and control of the most strategic sources. These resource imbalances shaped political tensions long before 1967. Why this geographic context matters for our talk here of the years between 1960 and 1967. By the early 1960s, Gaza was tiny, crowded, and economically isolated. The West Bank was larger, but under Jordanian rule and cut off from Gaza. Israel controlled most of the land and most of the reliable water sources. Refugees were concentrated in the smallest, least resourced areas. This is the physical landscape in which Palestinian nationalism reorganizes, Fedayeen activity increases, and regional tensions escalate toward the Six-Day War. So let's talk now about movement between Gaza and West Bank. Movement between Gaza and the West Bank in the 1960s was shaped by who controlled each territory and what the borders actually were. Gaza was under Egyptian administration, the West Bank under Jordanian rule, and the land between them was Israel. That meant any travel between the two Palestinian majority areas required crossing Israeli territory, even though neither Gaza nor the West Bank was under Israeli control at the time. The key point is that Israel controlled the space in between, so Palestinians could not move directly from one to the other without passing through Israeli checkpoints or border controls. The available historical evidence shows that movement was heavily restricted, and the systems that later became formalized after 1967 were already taking shape. So just to recap who controlled what in the early 1960s, Gaza was administered by Egypt, West Bank annexed and administered by Jordan, and the territory between them controlled by Israel, and no direct corridor existed between Gaza and the West Bank. This meant Palestinians were effectively living in two disconnected enclaves, with the only land route between them running through a state that did not permit free passage. What movement looked like before 1967? There was no open, routine, or guaranteed travel between Gaza and the West Bank. The systems that later became formalized as the permit regime were already emerging. Historical accounts show that Israel imposed permit requirements and curfews on Palestinians as early as 1948. These restrictions applied to Palestinians inside Israel and shaped how they could move through Israeli territory. Because Gaza and the West Bank were separated by Israel, Palestinians in either territory were subject to those controls if they attempted to cross. In practice, this meant travel was rare, permits were difficult to obtain, reasons for travel did not guarantee approval, and Israel had full discretion to allow or deny movement. There is no evidence of a standardized, predictable system for humanitarian travel, such as funerals, weddings, visiting relatives, or economic travel, such as selling produce. Instead, movement depended on Israeli military regulations, which were restrictive and often arbitrary. Did people need special passes? Yes. Even before the occupation of 1967, Israel used permit requirements to control Palestinian movement through its territory. These regulations were originally applied to Palestinian citizens of Israel after 1948 and were later incorporated into the military laws governing the occupied territories after 1967. Because Gaza and the West Bank were separated by Israel, any Palestinian attempting to travel between them would have needed Israeli permission, and such permission was rarely granted. So available evidence indicates that movement was severely limited, permits were difficult to obtain, and security concerns were cited to justify denials. Israel's early permit system was designed to restrict, not facilitate, Palestinian movement. Scholars describe it as a system that turned freedom of movement into a revocable privilege rather than a right. Did the reason for travel matter? Historical documentation shows humanitarian reasons such as funerals, weddings, visiting family did not guarantee approval. Economic reasons such as selling produce or seeking work were also not reliable grounds for receiving a permit, and decisions were made by Israeli authorities on a case-by-case basis with no transparent criteria. The system was characterized by arbitrariness, security-based justifications, and tight control. So what this meant for Palestinians in 1960. By the early 1960s, Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank were geographically separated, politically separated, so Egypt versus Jordan, economically separated, and unable to travel freely between their two main population centers. This fragmentation shaped Palestinian social life, family networks, economic opportunities, and political organizing. It also set the stage for even more restrictive systems that would emerge after Israel occupied both territories in 1967. So let's now move ahead to Gaza being overcrowded, aid-dependent, and resource-poor. Gaza in the early 1960s was the most food insecure of the three regions. It was tiny, densely populated, and cut off from the agricultural heartlands of the West Bank. Egypt administered Gaza but did not integrate it economically. Israel controlled the territory between Gaza and the West Bank, so Gazans could not move produce, labor, or goods freely. Several factors drove scarcity. So first, overcrowding. Gaza held more than 200,000 refugees in a strip only 140 square miles. Second, limited farmland. Most of Gaza's arable land had been lost in 1948. What remained could not feed the population. Third, reliance on UNRWA. Food rations were a core part of survival for many families. Fourth, restricted movement. Crossing into Israel required permits that were rarely granted, limiting access to markets or seasonal work. Fifth, weak water resources. Gaza relied on the coastal aquifer, which was already strained and less reliable than the West Bank's mountain aquifer. Gaza's food scarcity was chronic, structural, and tied directly to its isolation. And now moving on to the West Bank, more land, more agriculture, but still constrained. The West Bank under Jordanian rule had better agricultural capacity and more stable food supplies. It had mountain terraces and valleys suitable for olives, grains, and vegetables, access to the mountain aquifer, the region's most reliable freshwater source, and integration into the Jordanian economy, which allowed some trade and mobility. But the West Bank still faced constraints. Loss of coastal access after 1948 cut off major markets. No direct access to Gaza, which had been a traditional trade partner. Border tensions with Israel that disrupted farming near the armistice lines, and refugee camps that strained local resources. Food scarcity was not as severe as in Gaza, but the region was not food secure in a modern sense. It was more self-sufficient than Gaza, but less so than Israel. And Israel, more land, more water, and state-supported agriculture. Israel in the early 1960s had the most stable food supply of the three regions. It controlled the most arable land of historic Palestine, the Jordan River headwaters, the Sea of Galilee, the region's largest freshwater reservoir, and the most productive agricultural zones, including the coastal plain and Jezreel Valley. Israel also heavily invested in irrigation systems, state-supported farming cooperatives, and food import infrastructure. Israel's food scarcity issues were minimal compared to Gaza and the West Bank. The country had both the land and the water to support large-scale agriculture. How separation between Gaza and the West Bank made scarcity worse. Because Israel sat between Gaza and the West Bank, Palestinians could not move food, goods, or labor between the two territories without Israeli permission. In practice, permits were rarely granted, economic exchange was minimal, family networks were severed, and seasonal labor migration was blocked. This meant Gaza could not access the West Bank's agricultural surplus, the West Bank could not access Gaza's fishing industry or coastal trade. Both territories became more dependent on their respective rulers, Egypt and Jordan, and on international aid. The separation created two isolated Palestinian economies, each with its own vulnerabilities. Shared water and its impact on food. Water shaped food security as much as land did. Israel controlled the Jordan River and Sea of Galilee, giving it the most reliable water for irrigation. The West Bank's mountain aquifer was productive, but flowed downhill into Israel, limiting Palestinian control. And Gaza's coastal aquifer was shallow, easily overdrawn, and increasingly brackish. This meant Israel could irrigate at scale, the West Bank could irrigate modestly, and Gaza could barely irrigate at all. Water scarcity translated directly into food scarcity. The bottom line is by the early 1960s, Israel had land, water, and state capacity for a stable food supply. West Bank had land and water but limited markets, which translated to moderate scarcity. And Gaza had neither land nor water and was isolated, which translated into chronic scarcity. The separation between Gaza and the West Bank made both territories more vulnerable, but Gaza suffered the most. Okay, let's move on now to Gaza's political environment under Egyptian rule. Egypt administered Gaza through military governors after 1948, but by the early 1960s, Cairo began loosening its control. This shift allowed new Palestinian institutions to form, and those institutions became the backbone of political life. Several developments stand out. A semi-elected Palestinian Legislative Council gave Gazans their first limited political representation under Egyptian rule. Trade unions emerged, especially in the refugee camps, where labor organizing became a way to address unemployment and scarcity. Women's organizations formed, often tied to education, literacy, and social welfare. And the Palestinian Liberation Army, the PLA, was established as part of the Arab League framework, giving Palestinians a formal military structure for the first time. These institutions mattered because they created a political sphere that had not existed in Gaza before. They also gave young Palestinians a sense of agency in a place where their daily lives were otherwise tightly constrained. The role of refugee camps. The refugee camps were not just places of poverty, they were places of political socialization. Several factors shaped this. Camps were overwhelmingly young, with a large percentage of the population under 25. UNRWA schools educated tens of thousands of children, creating a literate generation with shared experiences. Scarcity and overcrowding created a sense of collective struggle, and families displaced from dozens of different towns and villages lived side by side, creating a shared narrative of loss. This environment produced a generation that was politically aware, socially connected, and increasingly organized. So now Fedayeen activity and border tensions. In the 1950s and early 1960s, some young Palestinians joined Fedayeen groups, fighters who carried out cross-border raids into Israel. These raids were not centrally organized at first. They were often small, local, and motivated by displacement, loss, or retaliation. Israel responded with military reprisals, which increased casualties in Gaza, deepened resentment, and reinforced the sense that Palestinians needed their own political and military structures. These cycles of action and response helped fuel the rise of nationalism. The founding of the PLO in 1964. The Palestine Liberation Organization was created in 1964 under Arab League sponsorship. While initially dominated by Egypt and other Arab states, it quickly became a symbolic home for Palestinian aspirations. Gaza played a central role. Many early PLO recruits came from Gaza's refugee camps. The PLA had a strong presence in the Strip, and political consciousness deepened as young people joined unions, student groups, and early political factions. The PLO's creation gave Palestinians a unified political identity that transcended the geographic separation of Gaza and the West Bank. Why nationalism intensified in Gaza specifically? Several forces converged. So there was isolation. Gaza was cut off from the West Bank and from the broader Arab world, except through Egypt. There was density. The population was young, crowded, and living in conditions that made political organizing easier. There was scarcity. Food, water, and employment pressures created a sense of urgency. Memory. Refugee families carried stories of their towns and villages, reinforcing a shared narrative of dispossession. And opportunity. Egypt's loosening of restrictions allowed political groups to form and operate. By the mid-1960s, Gaza had become one of the most politically active Palestinian regions. How this set the stage for 1967. As the decade progressed, Fedayeen activity increased, Israeli reprisals intensified, Nasser's regional posture hardened, the PLO gained visibility, and Gaza's population became more politically mobilized. When the Six-Day War erupted in June 1967, Gaza was not just a geographic front line, it was a political one. So I've mentioned the Arab League a couple times, so let's add some context to that. The Arab League, what it is and why it mattered in the 1960s. Origins and purpose. The Arab League, formerly the League of Arab States, was founded in 1945 by 7 founding members: Egypt, Iraq, Transjordan, later Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Yemen. Its creation came at the end of World War II during the collapse of European empires and reflected a shared desire among Arab states to coordinate politically, defend common interest, and present a unified front in international affairs. Its core missions included strengthening ties among Arab states, coordinating political positions, supporting independence movements and addressing shared regional issues, including Palestine. From the beginning, Palestine was a central agenda item. The Arab League created committees, military coordination bodies, and later the framework that would lead to the founding of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, in 1964. Membership and structure. By the early 1960s, the League included most independent Arab states. It operated through a council of member state representatives, specialized committees, so military, economic, cultural, and periodic summits where heads of state met to coordinate strategy. These summits often revolved around the Arab-Israeli conflict. One example that I found was it showed Nasser mediating between Jordan and the PLO at the 1970 Arab League Summit in Cairo, underscoring his central role in the League's diplomacy. Why the Arab League mattered for Palestinians. For Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, the Arab League was the main regional body claiming to represent their interests, the sponsor of the PLO, the forum where Arab states debated strategy toward Israel, and the arena where Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and others competed for influence over the Palestinian cause. By the early 1960s, the League's decisions directly shaped Gaza's political environment, especially through Egypt's administration of the Strip and the creation of the Palestine Liberation Army. So I've mentioned Nasser. Let's talk about him for a moment. I'm terrible with pronunciation, so hopefully I don't butcher his name. But Gamal Abdel Nasser, who he was and why he mattered. Nasser, 1918 to 1970, was the president of Egypt and one of the most influential Arab leaders of the 20th century. He rose to power after the 1952 Free Officers' coup that overthrew the Egyptian monarchy. By the mid-1950s, he had become the face of Arab nationalism, anti-colonialism, and pan-Arab unity. He was also a central figure in the Arab League's politics, shaping its direction and its relationship to the Palestinian cause, as documented in scholarship on his leadership and the League's evolution. So Nasser's ideology. Nasser championed pan-Arabism, so the idea that Arab peoples shared a common destiny, anti-imperialism, resisting Western influence in the Middle East, Arab socialism, state-led economic development, and support for Palestinian liberation. His speeches and policies made him a hero across the Arab world, especially among Palestinians. Nasser and Palestine. Nasser's influence on the Palestinian cause was profound. He administered Gaza after 1948. He allowed the creation of Palestinian political institutions in the early 1960s. He supported the formation of the PLO in 1964. He positioned Egypt as the leader of the Arab response to Israel. And his decisions in 1967, so mobilizing troops in Sinai, requesting the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers, and closing the Straits of Tiran, were key triggers of the Six-Day War. Nasser's leadership style and regional stature are reflected in the way he mediated conflicts within the Arab League, including between Jordan and the PLO in 1970, just hours before his death. Why Nasser mattered specifically for Gaza. Gaza was under Egyptian administration from 1948 to 1967. That meant Nasser's policies directly shaped daily life in the Strip. His decisions determined how much political space Palestinians had. His regional strategy influenced border tensions and Fedayeen activity, and his leadership set the tone for Arab League involvement in the Palestinian question. By the early 1960s, Nasser's Egypt was the most influential Arab state, and Gaza was one of the territories where his ideology and policies were most visible. What the PLO actually was in the 1960s. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was founded in 1964 by the Arab League, not by Palestinians themselves. Its purpose was to create a unified political body that could speak for Palestinians who had been dispersed and lacked centralized leadership after 1948. In its early years, it was not a government, it did not administer territory, it did not control Gaza or the West Bank, and it was largely directed by Arab states, especially Egypt, under Nasser. The PLO's military wing, the Palestine Liberation Army, the PLA, was also controlled in practice by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, not by Palestinians themselves. So in the 1960s, the PLO was a political umbrella organization, not a governing authority. Who actually governed Gaza in the 1960s? Gaza was under Egyptian military administration from 1948 to 1967. Egypt appointed military governors, controlled borders, issued permits, and oversaw daily life. The PLO had influence in Gaza, especially through political organizing, unions, and the PLA, but it had no governing power. when the PLO did become a governing body. This shift happened decades later after the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, when the PLO created the Palestinian Authority, the PA, to administer parts of the West Bank and Gaza. That's long after the period that we are covering in this talk. So in the early 1960s, the PLO in Gaza was not a government, not an administration, and not a territorial authority. It was a political representative body, in theory, a symbolic center of Palestinian nationalism, a military and political umbrella for various factions, and an organization heavily shaped by Egypt, especially in those early years. Gaza's actual governance remained in Egyptian hands until the Six-Day War in 1967. Let's now talk about regional politics shaping Gaza in the early 1960s. So, rivalries inside the Arab world. Even though the Arab League existed to coordinate Arab states, the 1950s and 1960s were marked by intense rivalries. Egypt versus Jordan over who represented Palestinian interests, Egypt versus Saudi Arabia over ideological leadership, so revolutionary Arab nationalism versus conservative monarchies, and then Egypt versus Syria after the collapse of the short-lived United Arab Republic from 1958 to 1961. These rivalries mattered because Palestinians were caught in the middle. Gaza, under Egyptian control, became a stage for Nasser's vision of Arab unity and resistance to Israel. Nasser's dominance. Nasser wasn't just Egypt's president. He was the most influential Arab leader of the era. His ideology, pan-Arabism, anti-imperialism, and support for Palestinian liberation, shaped the entire region's posture toward Israel. His speeches were broadcast across the Arab world, and Palestinians, especially in Gaza, saw him as a champion of their cause. The Arab League's role. The Arab League was the formal body coordinating Arab states, but in practice, it was shaped by Nasser's influence. It was the League that sponsored the creation of the PLO in 1964, established the Palestine Liberation Army, coordinated military planning among Arab states, and debated how to respond to Israeli reprisals and Fedayeen activity. This meant that Gaza's political life was not just local, it was tied to regional strategy. Why this matters for 1967. By the mid-1960s, the Arab world was politically divided, militarily uncoordinated, and rhetorically unified, but strategically fragmented. This tension created a volatile environment where symbolic gestures, military posturing, and political pressure could escalate quickly, and did. By the mid-1960s, the Arab-Israeli conflict was shaped by three overlapping dynamics. First, Palestinian guerrilla activity, Fedayeen, increasing along Israel's borders, especially from Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. Arab state rivalries with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan competing for leadership of the Palestinian cause. And third, Cold War entanglements, including Soviet intelligence reports that heightened regional fears. These pressures created a volatile environment in which symbolic moves could escalate quickly. Let's move now to border clashes and rising tensions. Palestinian guerrilla attacks. Palestinian groups based in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan increased cross-border attacks on Israel in the mid-1960s. These attacks were small in scale but politically explosive, and Israel responded with forceful reprisals. Britannica notes that these guerrilla attacks had increased, leading to costly Israeli reprisals in the months before the war. Israeli reprisals. One of the most significant reprisals occurred in November 1966 when Israel struck the Jordanian village of, and I'm probably going to say this wrong, Al-Samu, killing 18 people and wounding 54. This attack intensified pressure on Arab leaders to respond more forcefully. Air battles with Syria. In April 1967, an air battle between Israel and Syria resulted in Israel shooting down 6 Syrian MiG fighter jets. This was a major humiliation for Syria and escalated the sense of crisis. The Soviet intelligence trigger. On May 13, 1967, the Soviet Union delivered a report to Egypt claiming that Israel was preparing to attack Syria. The report was false, but it had enormous consequences. It pushed Nasser to take dramatic steps to demonstrate leadership and solidarity with Syria. This is the moment where the crisis becomes unavoidable. Nasser's escalation steps. Nasser had been criticized in the Arab world for not doing enough to support Syria and Jordan. The Soviet report gave him an opportunity to reclaim leadership. Step 1. Mobilizing Egyptian forces. On May 14, 1967, Nasser ordered Egyptian troops into the Sinai Peninsula. Step 2. Expelling the UN peacekeepers. On May 18th, he demanded the withdrawal of the United Nations Emergency Force, the UNEF, which had been stationed in Sinai since the Suez Crisis. The UN complied. Step 3. Closing the Straits of Tiran. On May 22nd, Nasser closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping, effectively blockading the port of Eilat. Israel had long declared that another closure of the Straits of Tiran would be an act of war. This was the decisive trigger. The Arab Defense Pact. On May 30, King Hussein of Jordan traveled to Cairo and signed a mutual defense pact with Egypt, placing Jordanian forces under Egyptian command. Iraq soon joined the alliance. This meant that if war broke out, Israel would be facing a coordinated front of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, with Iraq in support, the final slide into war. By early June, Egyptian forces were massed in Sinai. Syrian forces were mobilized on the Golan Heights. Jordanian forces were under Egyptian command, and Israeli leaders believed they faced an imminent multi-front attack. On the morning of June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive airstrike that destroyed more than 90% of Egypt's air force on the ground. This marked the beginning of the Six-Day War. Why this mattered for Gaza. During the war, Israel captured the Gaza Strip from Egypt. It also captured the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. Gaza's 19-year period under Egyptian administration ended abruptly. A new era of Israeli occupation began, one that continues in various forms to this day. Gaza's political, economic, and social trajectory after 1967 cannot be understood without this moment. What Gaza's civilians experienced during the war, the shock of rapid military collapse. Egyptian forces in Gaza were overwhelmed almost immediately. Israel's destruction of Egypt's air force on the morning of June 5th left Egyptian troops without air cover, and the ground advance into Gaza began the next day. Civilians saw columns of Israeli armor entering from the northeast and along the coastal road, Egyptian units retreating in disarray, and little organized defense inside the Strip. The fighting was brief but intense in pockets, especially around Gaza City and Khan Yunis. Fear, confusion, and lack of information. Most civilians had no radios, and electricity was unreliable. News traveled by rumor. People did not know whether Egypt was winning or losing, whether the fighting would reach their neighborhood, and whether they should flee or shelter in place. Many families stayed inside their homes, listening for artillery and aircraft, waiting for soldiers to appear in the streets. Refugee trauma resurfacing. Gaza in 1967 was still overwhelmingly populated by refugees from 1948. When the war began, memories of the Nakba were fresh. Families feared a second displacement. Some attempted to flee toward Egypt, but the border was closed. Others hid in UNRWA schools or camp clinics. The psychological impact was profound. People who had already lost everything once feared it was happening again. Civilian casualties and arrests. Exact numbers for Gaza alone are not well documented, but the broader war caused thousands of Arab military deaths and significant civilian casualties across the region. In Gaza, some civilians were killed in crossfire, others were killed when Israeli forces entered refugee camps. Hundreds of men were detained in the first days of occupation. The immediate aftermath included mass roundups of young men for questioning. How Israeli occupation was established. Military control within hours. Once Egyptian forces collapsed, Israel moved quickly to impose order. Gaza was small, densely populated, and already surrounded on three sides by Israel, which made rapid control possible. By the evening of June 6th, major roads were secured, government buildings were occupied, Egyptian administrators had fled or been captured. Israel declared the Strip under military rule. Dismantling Egyptian administration. Egyptian police, civil servants, and military officers were removed. Israel replaced them with military governors, Israeli civil administrators, new permit systems for movement and employment. This mirrored the system Israel simultaneously imposed in the West Bank. Control of borders and movement. Israel immediately sealed Gaza's borders. No exit to Egypt, no movement to the West Bank, no fishing beyond narrow coastal limits, and no travel without Israeli-issued permits. This was the beginning of the permit regime that would define Palestinian life for decades. Census and ID system. Within months, Israel conducted a census in Gaza and issued new ID cards. Anyone absent during the census was classified as a non-resident, which meant they could not return, they lost legal status in Gaza, and families were permanently separated. This contributed to the 413,000 Palestinians displaced across the region during the war. Integration into Israel's economic orbit. By late 1967, tens of thousands of Gazans were working inside Israel under daily permit systems. Gaza's economy became dependent on Israeli labor markets. Agriculture and fishing were restricted, and imports and exports were controlled by Israeli authorities. This economic dependency was not accidental. It was part of the occupation's structure. Surveillance and intelligence networks. Israel built extensive intelligence networks inside Gaza, informant systems, monitoring of political groups, restrictions on organizing, and arrests of suspected militants. This was especially focused on refugee camps where political activity was strongest. Why this moment matters for everything that follows. The Six-Day War did not just change borders, it changed the daily architecture of Palestinian life. For Gaza, Egyptian rule ended overnight. Israeli military occupation began immediately. Movement was restricted, the economy was reoriented, political organizing was monitored or suppressed, and a generation grew up under direct military rule. The trauma of 1967 sits alongside the trauma of 1948 in Gaza's collective memory. It is the hinge between the refugee enclave of the 1950s and 60s and the occupied territory of the 1970s through the 2000s. So let's go through what happened on the 6 days of the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War ran from June 5th through June 10th, 1967. On day 1, June 5th, Israel launches a preemptive airstrike that destroys most of Egypt's air force on the ground. Fighting begins on all fronts. On day 2, June 6, Israeli ground forces advance rapidly into Sinai, Gaza, and the West Bank. Gaza falls to Israeli forces. On day 3, June 7th, Israel captures East Jerusalem, including the Old City, and secures the West Bank. Sinai continues to collapse. On day 4, June 8th, fighting continues in Sinai. Egypt's retreat becomes chaotic. The USS Liberty incident occurs in the Mediterranean. On day 5, June 9th, Israel launches a major offensive against Syria and begins capturing the Golan Heights. On day 6, June 10th, fighting on the Golan Heights ends. A ceasefire takes effect. The war is over. Let's talk for a moment about strategic and military value. The West Bank and Gaza provided buffer zones that Israel did not have before 1967. Israel is geographically narrow, only about 9 miles wide at its thinnest point pre-1967. So controlling the highlands of the West Bank and the approaches around Gaza dramatically changed its defensive posture. West Bank, controlling the ridgeline overlooking Israel's coastal plain, reduced the fear of invasion from the east. Gaza, controlling the Strip, removed the Egyptian military presence from Israel's southern flank and secured the route to the Sinai. This strategic logic was central to Israeli military thinking in 1967 and afterward. Political and ideological motivations. For many Israeli leaders, especially those influenced by religious or historical nationalism, the West Bank, often referred to as Judea or Samaria, was seen as part of the ancient Jewish homeland. This ideological claim helped drive early settlement activity and shape debates about annexation. Gaza did not carry the same ideological weight, but it was still viewed as part of the broader territorial claim to historic Palestine. Israeli officials after 1967 asserted ownership of the land by right, even as they hesitated to annex Gaza because of its large Palestinian population. Preventing a Palestinian state. One of the clearest themes in the archival analysis is that Israel's control of Gaza and the West Bank functioned to block the emergence of a Palestinian state. Gaza, in particular, became a place where Israeli policy aimed to fragment Palestinian political life and prevent unified governance. Scholars describe Gaza as a laboratory for policies that combined military control, economic dependency, and settlement expansion to maintain dominance and prevent Palestinian sovereignty. The West Bank, with its larger land area and population, was even more central to this strategy. Settlement expansion, land seizures, and administrative control all served to undermine the territorial contiguity needed for a viable Palestinian state, a pattern that continues in this present day. Demographic considerations. Israel's leaders understood immediately after 1967 that annexing Gaza or the West Bank outright would mean absorbing large Palestinian populations. Gaza especially was overwhelmingly refugee and densely populated. This demographic reality is one reason Israel did not annex Gaza, despite asserting historical claims to the land. As one analysis notes, the presence of so many refugees prevented Israel from annexing it after the war. The West Bank posed a similar dilemma, though its land was more attractive and its population more dispersed. This tension, territorial desire versus demographic risk, has shaped Israeli policy ever since. Economic and administrative control. After 1967, Israel integrated Gaza and the West Bank into its economic system. Palestinians became dependent on work permits inside Israel. Israel controlled imports, exports, and taxation. Land registration and planning authorities shifted to Israeli hands, especially in the West Bank, where new regulations facilitated settlement expansion and weakened Palestinian governance structures. This economic dependency reinforced political control and made withdrawal more complicated. How these motives differed between Gaza and the West Bank. A simple way to frame it is, in the West Bank, it's high ideological value, high strategic value, high demographic risk. In Gaza, high strategic value, low ideological value, extremely high demographic risk. This is why Israel invested heavily in West Bank settlement but never annexed Gaza, and why Gaza was often treated as a place to be controlled, contained, or managed rather than integrated. For those of you who are used to my content, you know I have an anthropology background, so let's look at how anthropology approached Palestine and Israel across the 20th century. So first, biblical Palestine, 19th century to the early 20th century. Early European and American anthropologists wrote about Palestine through a biblical lens, treating the land as a backdrop for Christian history rather than a place with contemporary people. This mode is described as the first phase of ethnographic engagement with Palestine. 2. Oriental Palestine, early 1900s to 1940s. During the British Mandate, anthropologists produced work shaped by Orientalist assumptions. Palestinians were depicted as timeless, traditional, and static. The scholarship often reinforced colonial narratives and later Zionist claims by portraying the land as underdeveloped and awaiting modernization. 3. Absent Palestine, post-1948 through the 1970s. After the Nakba and the creation of Israel, English-language anthropology largely ignored Palestinians. Palestinians were often missing from ethnographies. Israeli anthropologists dominated the field, and their work frequently contrasted traditional Arabs within modern Israeli society. This period is described as one in which anthropology's silence effectively supported Zionist narratives. So basically, anthropologists were not documenting Palestinian life well at the time, and that absence itself is a historical fact. 4. Arrival and critique, 1980s, 1990s. By the 1980s, two shifts changed the field. Post-structural theory challenged old colonial frameworks, and cracks in Israeli nationalism after the 1982 Lebanon War opened space for critique. Anthropologists began to question Israeli state power, center Palestinian lived experience, and analyze occupation as a structure, not a backdrop. This is when Palestine became admissible as a legitimate anthropological subject. 5. The contemporary rise of Palestinian anthropology, the 2010s to present. Recent scholarship shows a proliferation of anthropological work on Palestine. A 2021 review describes this as a rise, building on the earlier arrival, and documents a surge of ethnographies focused on daily life under occupation, bureaucracy and permits, refugee camp life, gender and family, activism and resistance, cultural heritage, prisons and policing, statelessness, and diaspora. This work explicitly aims to give Palestinians discursive enfranchisement a voice in global academic conversations. There are anthropologists who studied the region in the 20th century, but with major gaps. Early 20th century work focused on biblical or Orientalist framings. Mid-century work often ignored Palestinians or treated them superficially. Only in the late 20th century did anthropologists begin documenting Palestinian life with depth and rigor. The absence itself is meaningful. Palestinians were living through displacement, military rule, scarcity, and political awakening, yet anthropology largely failed to record their experiences in real time. The discipline's silence mirrored broader political erasures. Today's anthropologists are actively correcting that record. Contemporary work, especially by Palestinian scholars, provides the richest ethnographic insight into the lived experience of occupation, displacement, and identity. So now let's shift to what those first years look like on the ground. Military rule and the legal framework. Total transfer of authority. Immediately after the June 1967 fighting ended, Israel issued Military Order No. 2, which stated all powers of government, legislation, appointment, and administration in the occupied territories were vested in the Israeli military governor alone. This replaced both the former Egyptian administration in Gaza and the Jordanian administration in the West Bank. The order made the military governor the sole source of law and authority in both territories. Belligerent occupation. International bodies, including the UN Security Council and the International Court of Justice, classified the West Bank and Gaza as occupied territory under international law. Israel's own Supreme Court described the territories as held in belligerent occupation. This legal framing shaped every aspect of governance. Military orders replaced civil law, and civilian life was subordinated to security considerations. Administrative restructuring, dismantling previous systems. Egyptian officials in Gaza and Jordanian officials in the West Bank fled or were removed. Israel replaced them with military governors, Israeli civil administrators, new permit and ID systems, and military courts. This created a unified administrative structure across both territories, even though Gaza and the West Bank remained geographically separated. Census and identity cards. Israel conducted a rapid census and issued new ID cards. Anyone absent during the census was classified as a non-resident, which meant they could not return. This permanently separated many families and shaped the demographic landscape for decades. Economic reorientation. Integration into Israel's labor market. Israel pursued a policy often described as coexistence in the first decade of occupation. The goal was to maintain calm by raising living standards while ensuring Palestinians remained dependent on Israel. Moshe Dayan, I'm sorry if I said that wrong, Moshe space Dayan, the defense minister, articulated this approach as allowing normal life to continue while Palestinians remained under Israeli rule. This included allowing Palestinians to work inside Israel, creating near full employment through low-wage labor, restricting independent Palestinian agriculture and industry, and controlling imports, exports, and taxation. The result was economic dependency. Palestinians could earn wages, but only within a system designed to prevent autonomous development. Land control and settlement groundwork. Land appropriation. From the earliest years, Israel used military orders to seize land for security or public purposes. In practice, this laid the foundation for future settlement construction. The Applied Research Institute Jerusalem notes that land appropriation for Jewish settlement was a defining feature of the occupation from the beginning. Strategic goals. The West Bank's highlands and Gaza's coastal corridor were seen as strategically valuable. Control of these areas provided territorial depth and removed Arab military forces from Israel's immediate borders. Daily life under occupation. Movement restrictions. Israel controlled all borders and internal movement. No travel between Gaza and the West Bank without Israeli permission. No exit to Egypt from Gaza. No exit to Jordan from the West Bank without permits, internal checkpoints, and curfews. These restrictions were enforced through the new ID system and military orders. Surveillance and policing. Israel built extensive intelligence networks, especially in refugee camps. Military orders criminalized political organizing, demonstrations, and many forms of association. Arrests, administrative detention, and interrogations became part of the occupation's daily machinery. Social impact. The combination of military rule, economic dependency, and restricted movement reshaped family life, education, employment, and political expression. Refugee camps remained overcrowded, and the trauma of 1948 was compounded by the new reality of direct military control. How these early years set the long-term trajectory. The first decade of occupation established patterns that would define the next half-century. Military orders as the governing framework, land seizures for settlement, economic dependency on Israel, fragmented Palestinian geography, suppression of political organization, and surveillance and control of daily life. These structures remained in place long after 1967 and shaped the political, economic, and social landscape that later produced the First Intifada, the Oslo process, and the eventual split between Gaza and the West Bank. So let's talk now about land after 1967. Israel's occupation did not formally annex Gaza or the West Bank in 1967, but it did begin a long process of territorial seizure, especially in the West Bank. So I want to make 2 points. Gaza lost very little land area because Israel did not build large settlements there, and the Strip is tiny and tightly bounded. The West Bank lost enormous amounts of land, especially in Area C, which Israel placed under full civil military control and has steadily converted into state land and settlement zones. So Gaza's land lost after 1967, what the record shows. Gaza's borders did not change after the Six-Day War. Israel occupied the entire Strip, but it did not annex territory or carve out large settlement blocks the way it did in the West Bank. The Strip remained roughly 140 square miles, the same size it had been under Egyptian administration. What did change? Even though Gaza did not lose large tracts of land on the map, Israel established military zones, built a small number of settlements and military installations, restricted access to farmland and coastal waters, and controlled borders, airspace, and territorial waters. These forms of control reshaped daily life, but they did not significantly reduce Gaza's formal land area. A key insight from the archival analysis is that demographics stopped Israel from annexing Gaza. The Strip's overwhelmingly refugee population made annexation politically and demographically undesirable for Israel. So Gaza's land loss was functional, not territorial, control without annexation. West Bank loss after 1967, the scale of loss. The West Bank's land loss is massive and ongoing. Area C makes up about 60% of the West Bank and is under full Israeli civil and military control. Israel is now formally registering large portions of this land as state property, enabling permanent seizure. This is the largest, most consequential land loss Palestinians have experienced since 1967. Recent quantification. Since October 2023 alone, Israel has seized nearly 60 square kilometers of the West Bank land. That's just the most recent documented wave. Settlement expansion and land appropriation have been continuous for decades. How the land is taken. The mechanisms include declaring land state land, seizing land for military needs, retroactively legalizing outposts, transferring planning authority from Palestinian municipalities to Israeli civil administration, and restarting land registration to claim unregistered plots as Israeli state property. These policies amount to de facto annexation, as multiple analysts and human rights organizations note. What this means in practice: the West Bank has been carved into settlement blocks, bypass roads, military zones, and fragmented Palestinian enclaves. The contiguity of Palestinian territory has been steadily eroded since 1967. So Gaza lost control, not territory. Israel occupied the whole strip, but did not annex or significantly shrink it, and land seizures were small and localized. West Bank lost huge amounts of land to settlements, military zones, and state land declarations. 60% of the territory, so Area C, is under full Israeli control, and land loss is ongoing and accelerating. So let's move on now to control over population movement. Israel's control over Gaza's crossings has evolved into a system where movement is not a right, but a lever of power. Al Jazeera describes this as a tool of siege, where closures and permits regulate who may leave, when, and under what conditions. The system affects every aspect of life: medical care, education, family reunification, and access to food and aid. Restricting exit keeps the population physically contained, which allows Israel to manage Gaza as a controlled and closed territory, limit political mobilization across borders, prevent the formation of independent economic or social ties, and maintain leverage over humanitarian conditions. Movement becomes a mechanism for shaping behavior and suppressing autonomy. Strategic interest in preventing return. When Israel has allowed limited exit, such as the one-way Rafah proposal, it has been framed as exit without return. The New Arab reports that Israel proposed reopening Rafah only for outbound movement, preventing Palestinians from returning and blocking humanitarian aid. This was widely condemned as a form of coerced displacement. This pattern reveals a strategic logic: allow people to leave, prevent them from coming back, reduce Gaza's population over time. Even when framed as humanitarian, these policies function as demographic engineering. Demographic and political calculations. A UN Commission of Inquiry found that Israel has demonstrated a consistent intent to maintain permanent control over Gaza while ensuring a Jewish majority in the broader territory under its authority. Restricting exit serves this demographic strategy in two ways. First, it keeps Palestinians concentrated in Gaza, preventing demographic shifts inside Israel or the West Bank. And two, it creates conditions that may push people to leave permanently if given a chance. The same report documents extensive land confiscation and the creation of buffer zones that have reduced the territory available to Palestinians by up to 75% of Gaza by mid-2025. Population control and land control operate together. Maintaining pressure and dependency. Movement restrictions also reinforce economic and humanitarian dependency. When Israel controls who can leave, what goods can enter, which patients can travel, which students can study abroad, which families can reunite, it shapes the entire social and economic structure of Gaza. Al Jazeera's reporting shows how closures have redefined survival itself, with aid trucks stranded, food spoiling, and medical evacuations blocked. This dependency gives Israel leverage over Gaza's internal dynamics. Why prohibiting exit is more useful than allowing it. Allowing free exit would enable Palestinians to build independent lives abroad, reduce Israel's leverage over Gaza's internal conditions, weaken the containment strategy, allow political actors to organize outside Israeli control, and undermine the demographic and territorial goals documented by the UN. By contrast, restricting exit keeps Gaza's population confined, dependent, and politically fragmented. The underlying logic: when you put these pieces together, the rationale becomes clear. So first, containment. Keep Gaza isolated and manageable. Second, control. Use movement as a pressure tool. Third, demographics. Prevent Palestinians from shifting into areas Israel wants to keep Jewish majority. Fourth, territorial strategy. Maintain dominance over Gaza without absorbing its population. And fifth, leverage. Use crossings to influence political and humanitarian outcomes. These motives are not mutually exclusive. They reinforce one another. Let's move on now to when the United States became Israel's close ally. The U.S.-Israel relationship did not begin as a deep alliance. It evolved in stages, and the turning point was 1967. Before 1967, cautious, distant, sometimes tense. The U.S. recognized Israel in 1948, but it did not supply major weapons. It tried to balance Arab and Israeli interests. It pressured Israel on refugees and borders, and it worried about alienating Arab oil states. Even in the early 1960s, the relationship was complicated. President Kennedy pressed Israel hard on nuclear inspections at Dimona and warned that U.S. support could be jeopardized if Israel refused. The turning point, the Six-Day War in 1967. After Israel's rapid victory, U.S. officials saw Israel as a Cold War asset. Israel demonstrated military capability that aligned with U.S. regional interests. Arab states moved closer to the Soviet Union, and Israel became a stable pro-U.S. foothold in a volatile region. This is when the relationship began to shift from sympathetic to strategic. The 1970s, the alliance deepens. By the early 1970s, the U.S. began supplying advanced weapons. Israel became a major non-NATO ally. U.S. diplomacy became central to Arab-Israeli negotiations. A 1999 analysis describes this as the evolution of an unwritten alliance that became the motor of U.S. Middle East diplomacy after 1967. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, this relationship had solidified into large-scale military aid, intelligence cooperation, diplomatic protection at the UN, and shared Cold War strategy. By this point, the U.S. was Israel's primary patron. So let's talk for a moment now about Jewish presence in Gaza and the West Bank in the late 1960s. In Gaza, there was no meaningful Jewish civilian population in Gaza in 1967. No historic Jewish communities lived there in the modern period. No Israeli civilians lived there before the war. After the war, Israel established military installations, not towns. Civilian settlements in Gaza came later, mostly in the 1970s and 1980s. And even then, the numbers were tiny compared to Palestinian population. So in the late 1960s, Gaza was 100% Palestinian, aside from Israeli soldiers and administrators. In the West Bank did have small historic Jewish communities before 1948, especially in Hebron and the Jewish quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem. Those communities were evacuated or killed in 1929, the Hebron Massacre, and again in 1948, Jordanian conquest. By 1967, no Jewish civilians lived in the West Bank. After the war, Israel began establishing settlements almost immediately. Kfar Etzion, I hope I said that right, reestablished in 1967, Hebron settlement nucleus, late 1960s, and early Nahal military agricultural outposts. But in the late 1960s, these were tiny, often just a few dozen people. The large settlement blocks we know today came later, mostly in the 1970s through 1990s. So in the late 1960s, both Gaza and the West Bank were essentially 100% Palestinian in population. Palestinian labor inside Israel in the early occupation. From 1967 through the 1970s, Israel adopted what Moshe Dayan called a policy of open bridges. Palestinians could work inside Israel, but could not gain residency or political rights, and could not move freely between Gaza and the West Bank. This created a labor pipeline that benefited Israel's economy while keeping Palestinians politically contained. Typical jobs Palestinians held inside Israel. These were overwhelmingly manual, low-wage, high-risk jobs that Israelis generally did not want. The most common sectors were construction. This was the single largest employer. Palestinians built homes, roads, public buildings, industrial zones. By the late 1970s, Palestinians made up a huge portion of Israel's construction workforce. Agriculture. Palestinians worked in citrus groves, vegetable farms, greenhouses, orchards. These jobs were seasonal and physically demanding. Manufacturing and light industry, especially in textiles, food processing, plastics, and small factories. These jobs were often low pay and lacked protections. Municipal and service work, including cleaning, sanitation, hotel work, and restaurant kitchens. These were the least secure jobs and often paid in cash. This labor system created a dependency loop. Palestinians needed Israeli wages to survive. Israel needed cheap labor to fuel its economy. Gaza and the West Bank remained economically underdeveloped by design, and political quiet was maintained through economic pressure. It was not accidental. It was a deliberate structure of control. So in summary, the political landscape before 1967. Gaza under Egypt and the West Bank under Jordan were politically, economically, and geographically separated. Gaza was overcrowded, aid-dependent, and tightly controlled. The West Bank had more land and agriculture, but limited economic opportunity. Israel, by contrast, had land, water, and state capacity. The rise of Palestinian nationalism. Gaza became a center of political awakening by the early 1960s. Refugee camps, UNRWA schools, labor unions, and the loosening of Egyptian control created a politically active generation. The Arab League's creation of the PLO in 1964 gave Palestinians a formal political body, even if it was initially dominated by Arab states. The regional climate, Nasser's leadership, Arab rivalries, Fedayeen activity, and Cold War dynamics created a volatile environment. The Soviet miscommunication in May 1967 triggered a cascade of escalations that led directly to the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War. From June 5th through the 10th, 1967, Israel captured Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. Gaza fell on June 6 after Egyptian forces collapsed. Civilians experienced fear, confusion, and the trauma of displacement resurfacing. The establishment of occupation. Israel imposed military rule immediately. Military Order No. 2 concentrated all governing authority in the hands of the military governor. A new ID system, border closures, land seizures, and economic reorientation reshaped daily life. Palestinians became a source of labor for Israel while remaining politically disenfranchised. The demographic and strategic logic. Israeli policymakers saw Gaza as a place to be controlled, not absorbed. The West Bank was seen as strategically and ideologically valuable. Gaza's population was viewed as a demographic threat, which shaped policies of containment and non-annexation. So where this leaves us. By the end of the 1960s, Gaza and the West Bank had entered a new era defined by military rule, restricted movement, economic dependency, land control, political suppression, and demographic anxiety. This is the foundation for everything that follows: settlement expansion, the rise of Hamas, the First Intifada, Oslo, and the eventual political split between Gaza and the West Bank. By the close of the 1960s, Gaza and the West Bank were no longer governed by Egypt or Jordan. They were under a new system of military rule that reshaped every aspect of Palestinian life. The structures built in those early years of occupation would define the next half-century. In our next episode, we'll look at how this occupation evolved, how settlements expanded, how daily life changed, and how Palestinians organized politically under a system designed to contain them. And that is where we're going to end things today. I thank you for joining me. If you are new to my channel, usually I have video that go along with these talks and with other content, but this series, this little arc, I am doing audio only as a test. So I am curious if anyone has viewed both. Let me know what you think. Do you like the audio better, or does it make no difference to you? Are you preferring the video format instead of audio only? I am just curious for my own future planning. I hope you found this episode informative and that you will continue to join me as we unpack what is going on in that region of the world. My research is ongoing. I do have part 4 planned. I will be releasing that hopefully within a day or two of the release of this episode. If you liked this video, please give it a like. If you're not subscribed, please click that button to subscribe. I appreciate comments, but please keep them respectful. This is not a place where we are going to hate on each other. And as always, thank you for being here. I appreciate your presence. I'll see you next time.